At the bottom of the world's oceans rest the remains of a war that ended 80 years ago, but which the sea has refused to forget. Combat aircraft with their wings still extended, bombers with their bomb bays open, fighters with navigation instruments still in place, all covered by decades of coral and marine life that has transformed the war machines into artificial reefs of disturbing beauty. We are not talking about a few scattered planes here and there. We are talking about underwater cemeteries with dozens, in some cases more than 100 aircraft, concentrated in specific ocean zones that have become some of the most extraordinary diving and underwater exploration sites on the planet, and involuntary monuments to the pilots and crew members who died in them. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Let us begin. To understand how these airplane cemeteries came to exist beneath the sea, one must understand the industrial scale of destruction that was the Second World War in its Pacific and Mediterranean theaters of operations. Between 1941 and 1945, the powers in conflict produced military aircraft in quantities that today seem almost incomprehensible. The United States alone manufactured more than 300,000 aircraft during the war years, a production that required the mobilization of the entire industrial capacity of the country, and that turned companies like Boeing, Grumman, Douglas, and North American into the nerve centers of an unprecedented war effort. Japan, Germany, and the other Axis powers produced tens of thousands of additional planes, and all those planes flew over oceans, over islands, over fjords, and over closed seas, in extreme combat conditions that made it inevitable that many of them would end up at the bottom of the water. Some sank shot down by enemy fire, others fell due to mechanical failures, navigation errors, adverse weather conditions, or simply from exhausting their fuel in the middle of the ocean. And many others did not fall in battle, but were deliberately sunk at the end of the war. When the victorious armies found themselves with enormous quantities of military equipment they no longer needed, and which was more efficient and economical to dispose of at sea than to transport back home or store indefinitely. This last case explains the existence of some of the largest and most concentrated airplane cemeteries known today. The Kwajalein Atoll in the Central Pacific Marshall Islands is the most dramatic example of this phenomenon. With approximately 160 submerged aircraft, Kwajalein constitutes the largest cemetery of World War II planes located in a relatively concentrated area. The history of how those planes came to be there combines combat losses with deliberate decisions made at the end of the conflict. During the Pacific Campaign, Kwajalein Atoll was the scene of intense combat between the Japanese forces that occupied it and the American Marines who attacked it in 1944. The planes that participated in those battles, both Japanese and American, left a trail of wrecks in the atoll's waters. But the majority of the 160 planes that today rest in those waters arrived there in 1945, when at the end of the war American military took the decision to dispose of surplus equipment by throwing it into the sea. Among those planes are F-4F Wildcat fighters, the aircraft that were the backbone of American naval aviation in the first and most difficult years of the Pacific War. The Wildcat was a robust, reliable aircraft with a surprisingly high combat survival rate thanks to its armor and the strength of its structure, but one that proved technically surpassed by the Japanese Zero in terms of maneuverability and speed. American pilots compensated for these disadvantages with specific combat tactics and with the solidity of their planes, and the Wildcat earned a place in military aviation history as the plane that held Japanese aviation at bay while the American industry developed the superior F-6F Hellcat. Seeing those same planes today, resting at the bottom of Kwajalein Atoll with their wings covered in coral and their cabins colonized by tropical fish, produces a mix of historical emotion and melancholy difficult to describe. Chuuk Lagoon, previously known as Truk Lagoon on the island of Micronesia, is perhaps the world's most famous war-wreck diving site, and for reasons that go far beyond the number of planes it contains. In February 1944, American naval and air forces launched Operation Hailstone, a massive and devastating attack against the Japanese naval base at Truk, which was at that time Japan's most important naval installation in the Central Pacific and had been considered practically impregnable. In 2 days of continuous attacks, the Americans sank dozens of Japanese ships, destroyed hundreds of planes, and eliminated Truk as an effective operational base for the Imperial Japanese Navy. What remained at the bottom of the lagoon was an underwater cemetery of extraordinary proportions. Warships, cargo ships, tanks traveling as cargo, ammunition, equipment of all kinds, and the Japanese planes that could not take off in time or were shot down during the attacks. Chuk Lagoon is not just a cemetery of machinery. It is also a human cemetery because inside many of those ships and planes remain the remains of the Japanese soldiers and sailors who died during Operation Hailstone or who were trapped when their vessels sank too quickly to allow escape. This reality makes Chuk a site that requires special treatment, a blend of respect for the fallen and recognition of the historical value of the place. Divers who visit the lagoon are received with warnings about the importance of not disturbing the human remains that can still be found inside the wrecks. And the Micronesian government has implemented strict regulations to protect the site from looting and irresponsible disturbance. On the other side of the world, in the Mediterranean and in the fjords of Norway, recent findings of World War II planes have added new pages to this underwater chapter of history. In waters near Syracuse, in Sicily, remains of German Junkers Ju-88 planes have been located, a versatile and feared twin-engine bomber that the Luftwaffe used in a huge variety of missions throughout the war. From dive bombing to anti-submarine attacks and photographic reconnaissance missions, the Mediterranean was an extremely intense theater of operations between 1940 and 1943, with aerial, naval, and ground battles that extended from Gibraltar to Egypt and left a trail of wrecks throughout the sea. The Ju-88s found near Syracuse are witnesses to the battles that preceded and accompanied the Allied landing in Sicily in July 1943, the operation that marked the beginning of the end of the fascist regime in Italy. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. In the Trondheim Fjord in Norway, the discovery is equally extraordinary, though for different reasons. Researchers have located 2 planes in that fjord, among them a BV-222, a genuinely exceptional aircraft from a historical standpoint. The BV-222 Viking was the largest flying boat to fly during the Second World War, a 6-engine giant with a wingspan comparable to some heavy bombers. Originally designed as a transatlantic luxury passenger aircraft for the Lufthansa airline, and converted when the war broke out for military transport and long-range reconnaissance missions. Only 13 examples of the BV-222 were built, making each one a piece of aviation history of incalculable value. Finding one at the bottom of the Trondheim Fjord is a find that aviation historians have described as extraordinary, and its study could reveal information about Luftwaffe operations in the Scandinavian theater not available in any historical archive. In the South Pacific, near New Guinea, the discovery of Australian bomber A9-186 adds another dimension to this global map of lost planes. New Guinea was the scene of some of the most brutal and forgotten battles of the Pacific War, a prolonged and devastating campaign in which the Allies, including Australian forces that fought with extraordinary courage and determination, struggled for years to expel Japanese forces from the island. The planes lost in those waters are testimonies to that effort, and the A9-186 is one of them, a plane that went out to fulfill a mission and did not return, whose fate remained unknown for decades until explorers found it at the bottom of the Pacific. One of the most moving and ethically complex aspects of all these findings is the presence, in some of the wrecks, of human remains of the crew members who died in them. In 2024, in a plane located in the Pacific, it was possible to identify the remains of a crew member, connecting decades later a name, a real person, with the plane in which they died. This type of identification, which requires DNA analysis, historical research in military archives, and coordination with the descendants of the fallen, represents the most human and most emotional dimension of underwater war archaeology. Behind each sunken plane is a personal story. There are families who waited for news that never came. There are military files marked with the notation of missing in action. There are names engraved on monuments to the fallen without anyone knowing exactly where the remains of those men lay. The ecological transformation of these submerged planes is another phenomenon that deserves attention. What began as war machinery, built to destroy and to kill, has become over the decades a substrate for vibrant and diverse marine ecosystems. The metallic structures of the planes, though corroded to varying degrees depending on the depth, water temperature, and metal composition, provide hard surfaces in environments where the seabed is predominantly sandy or muddy, and those hard surfaces are exactly what corals, sponges, and other sessile organisms need to establish themselves and grow. Once those colonizing organisms settle, they in turn attract the fish and invertebrates that feed on them. And within a few decades, what was a combat aircraft becomes an artificial reef as rich and diverse as any natural coral reef. Divers who visit Kwajalein Atoll, Chuk Lagoon, or the Mediterranean wrecks are not just doing history or archaeology. They are also exploring unique ecosystems that would not exist without those sunken planes. It is a beautiful and deeply significant paradox. The machines designed for destruction have become, with time and the help of the ocean, centers of life. The F-4F Wildcats of Kwajalein, the Japanese bombers of Chuk, the Ju-88s of Syracuse, and the gigantic BV-222 of the Trondheim Fjord are today homes for thousands of marine organisms that have no awareness of the human history surrounding them, that simply found in those metallic structures a place to live and thrive. What these aircraft cemeteries tell us ultimately is that war leaves marks that time does not erase but transforms. The ocean has not erased the World War II planes. It has changed them, covered them with life, turned them into something different from what they were, but has preserved them as witnesses to a period that must not be forgotten. Each time a diver descends to the bottom of Chuk Lagoon and finds themselves before the wings of a coral-covered Japanese plane, or when an ROV illuminates in the darkness of the Pacific the contours of an Australian bomber lost 80 years ago, there is an encounter between the present and the past that has something sacred about it, something that reminds us that history is not only in books and museums, but also at the bottom of the sea, waiting to be rediscovered by those with sufficient curiosity and respect to seek it. Leave your like, subscribe, and share. Until next time.